All right, bear with me. This is going to be a little bit all over the place at the beginning, but hopefully it gels into something coherent pretty quickly. Okay, you hear the chatter? The reason why you hear the chatter is because I've made a couple of other attempts already at doing this video and wasn't pleased with the result because I feel like, for lack of a more eloquent term, I kind of wussed out. Because this is a very cringe-inducing topic for me, and it might also be for you as a sword enthusiast. What am I talking about? Blade-to-blade contact. Now, I recently did a video on high open guard, which applies to other open guards in terms of a couple of general philosophies of use for me. But I ended that video on sort of a to be continued because I did not address the topic of countercutting, which is very common in many, many different kinds of swordsmanship. What is a countercut? Especially from an open guard, the idea is you've created an invitation. And when your opponent then attacks you, you respond to their attack with, it's fundamentally initially a parry, but it looks like a cut, or basically is a cut, against their weapon, right? Now then, there are three potential applications for this. The first of which is you do it because you have to. You're not in a good situation, position, distance, you don't have the opening, and basically all you can do is strike against the opponent's weapon to protect yourself. But ideally, you can make one of the other two happen. The first one would be set up that countercut so that you can very quickly come in with a follow-up attack to a more high-value target. Strike their weapon, strike them. Strike their weapon, thrust into them. Something like that very quickly to take advantage of that countercut. The other possibility, which is in some ways even more ideal, is to do it in a single timing where you aim your countercut so that not only do you deflect your opponent's incoming attack, but you kind of move through it, around it, and strike that high-value target at the same time. Or thrust into that high-value target at the same time you make the blade contact. So you're hitting their blade and them simultaneously. But yeah, we're talking about blade-to-blade contact here. And this is also going to apply to all sorts of other parries. Now again, these are super common in every kind of swordsmanship, but if you're a student of Japanese-style swordsmanship, you've probably heard that there is a premium on avoiding blade-to-blade contact. And some of that is based on the design of the Japanese-style sword. Now, before we proceed, caveats as always, I don't consider myself any kind of master expert, anything like that. I never intend to contradict anything that you are being taught, studying, practicing. None of this is ever intended to represent the teaching of any traditional system. This is just my experience, my practice. Hopefully it's helpful, useful. Let me know in the comments. Caveat 4, though, usually doesn't come up very often. It's probably a good thing. And caveat 4 is the don't try this at home. I'm not what anyone would call a professional. We are going to be doing some demonstrations of live blade-to-blade contact. Now, I'm going to be taking some steps to protect myself, but there's still going to be sharp swords involved. And I'm operating to a level that, based on my experience, I'm comfortable with, and yes, the risk is mine. But if you value yourself, don't try this at home. Also, this is not intended to be a destructive test. As a matter of fact, we're going to discuss techniques to minimize damage to your sword. But yes, even though the sword is still functional, despite my best efforts to resharpen it, there's still some nicks in it. So, if you want to keep your sword pristine, don't. So if you value yourself, don't. If you value your sword, don't. Hopefully you at least value the first one, if not the second one. If you want to see a destructive test, if you want to see how much a blade can take, watch Matthew Jensen. He's awesome. Or just watch Matthew Jensen because he's awesome. All right. What are the specific conditions we're talking about today? All right, let's talk briefly about that premium for avoiding edge-to-edge contact in a lot of Japanese-style swordsmanship. And a lot of it is about the design of the sword, the things that it's great at based on that design, and then a couple of vulnerabilities because of that. Now, depending on the system that you're studying, you may be practicing kata combinations, whatever, that include blocks, parries, countercuts, right? And you may be a little concerned about that, depending on your experience, especially if you practice cutting. And there's a couple of things to consider in that. One thing that I was taught in my training with Boken with a partner, whether we're talking about controlled free fencing or choreographed partner kata, is that you're intentionally practicing those slightly outside of measure, so that your weapons are crossing, but you're not really in range to hit the person in the head or clavicle or some other place you could fracture with a heavy wooden practice weapon. So an element of safety, though you could still certainly smash hands and forearms and stuff like that. So you still have to be careful and develop really good practices. And then the idea is they tell you that if you're doing this for real, you would simply close measure about a foot or so that your blade is instead making contact, not with the opponent's weapon, but with their arms and or body, right? Now there is a difference between what's known as battlefield swordsmanship and dueling, which I'll talk about in other videos. But in that dueling scenario, one-on-one against another skilled opponent who's focused on you, they are certainly keenly aware of your priority for hitting their arms, just as they would be against you. They're not going to let you do that. They're going to work on controlling measure just like you are. So you're probably going to wind up in a situation like that with a lot more steel-to-steel contact than you would ideally want. Now, the vulnerability specifically in the Japanese style sword, and I need to put the caveat in, not all of them historically. For instance, I have done these experiments and a lot worse in my stupid youth over the decades with my original antique Shingunto Yoshi. Now Yoshi, as I've mentioned, is overbuilt, heavy, well-tempered, hard edge, but a lot of meat behind that edge, more of a hatchet than a razor blade. And I'm going to also repeat this experiment with European style swords that have blunted forts that are designed to take impact, or a lot more meat behind the edge, or different tempering. Now, I'm going to focus on the modern reproduction Japanese style sword. Many of these are marketed to your backyard cutters or your competition cutters. So you tend to get blades that have very keen edges, with not necessarily a lot of meat behind them, especially if you don't want a heavier sword, you want something lighter, quicker, probably doesn't have a lot of meat behind that edge. Might even have a wider blade or a wider ridge plane to give you even less meat behind that edge, make it more of a razor blade. Add to that our love of that clay tempered edge, right? The hamon, which might give you then an edge that's 5860 Rockwell. Great razor blade, but potentially extremely brittle. If you are a cutter, you may have already experienced the tragedy that happens when you accidentally hit something, not steel, but sometimes we're talking about wood, accidentally clipping your cutting stand, or bamboo that's a little bit too dry, or maybe even the hard neck of a bottle might damage your sword. Sometimes catastrophically so. And then you can only imagine what would happen if you hit steel with that edge. But it's not just about the edge. Let's talk about our test media first before we proceed. Now, this, I'm going cheap. And I don't intend to destroy the sword, but I'm not terribly concerned with this one. This is my Ryujin Hatamoto. It was cheap. It's a 1060 clay tempered, and I've had some issues with it. You can refer to the review that I did on it where I talked about some of the problems I've had with it. But yes, despite my best efforts, and I'll demonstrate how I do this to minimize damage, it's taken some microchipping, some micro rolling. Now, ad copy on this sword says it's got a 40 spine and a 60 edge Rockwell. From resharpening it, I doubt it. My files and stones react to it more like it's a 55-ish, which is perfectly adequate for a sword like this, and it does make it a good cutter. But if it was a 60, I would think it would be more brittle and maybe even have taken more damage potentially, or not, depending on the conditions. But know what we're working with here. What's my target media? Well, okay, it's going to be a little silly. This is not the rig we're going to actually use live. But what this is the blade of my handmade, well, they called it a wakizashi. It's kind of a shinobi katana, and you can refer to my review on that. I wasn't terribly pleased with it. It's a 1045 mono-tempered blade. It is sharp. I did take off the mountings, the hilt. I really like those. Repurpose those. But the blade I don't care too much about. It's cheap, it's soft, but still, even this, theoretically, this sword is significantly softer than this one, but it is perfectly capable of damaging this sword. What I'm going to do, a couple of things. One, safety first. There's an end cap on there so I don't impale myself, but the edge is sharp. I'm going to make sure it is out of line with me, or out of measure, or both. But it's still a sharp blade, and accidents can happen. I'm only going to operate hopefully within my personal comfort zone. Again, don't try something like this at home. Also, this blade is going to be stationary. It's not going to be moving. Obviously, if moving blade hit moving blade, those impacts are going to be ramped up significantly. But the idea is we're going for a relatively gentle analog of those collisions, which can hopefully then give you a sense of what would happen, well, if it was worse. But this also helps me make it safer. Now, a couple of different kinds of collisions we can talk about. Flat to flat is something that could potentially, well, scuff up your polish. Maybe put a little bit of a dent, hopefully not create any kind of bend or anything more serious than that, depending, again, on how your sword is built and tempered. You can also talk about flat to spine. You can talk about spine to spine or spine to flat. There are certain parries that kind of hook the opponent's weapon down, and those might incur some dents to your spine, especially the peaked spine. But hopefully, again, that wouldn't be something catastrophic, unless, again, your sword has a fatal flaw and it's ready to go. Yeah, a hit to the spine the wrong way it's a great way to break a sword, but hopefully that's not going to be an issue. It's one of those things that has a tendency to surprise people, though, in the worst way when it happens. But the biggest concern is going to be edge into steel, into spine, into flat, and yes, the worst type, which is into edge to edge. Even this softer metal is perfectly capable of rolling or chipping, especially if I'm hitting the corner of something. It's going to do more damage to this than it is to this, but it's still going to do damage to this. Edge to edge, though, yeah, that's going to be your worst outcome. So a couple of things that I have learned to do, again, from my stupid youth experience, that have helped me minimize that kind of damage when I do, again, dumbass experiments like this. I don't hit a sword, if I can avoid it, at a right angle, okay? If at all possible, I'm going to try to change the angle of attack so it's a lot less acute, and the swords are crossing a little bit more. So I'm going to go for more angle, so I'm not hitting the thing perfectly perpendicularly. The other thing I'm going to try to do is if I'm striking the weapon with my edge, or it's striking my edge, I'm not going to hit it, if I can avoid it, perpendicularly, straight on like that, okay? What I've learned to do is turn my edge slightly, let's say about 45 degrees in that impact. What that does, for me, I found, is it spreads out the impact a little bit more obliquely across the hamon, which can result in a roll and maybe a little bit of a gouge or a chip, but it's usually not that big catastrophic, kind of half-moon chip or a serious crack or something. It's usually something that's repairable or something I can live with. It's not going to necessarily destroy the sword or its effectiveness. Maybe. Depends on how hard it is. The other thing that slightly angular impact does for me is it creates a little bit of a twist of the sword in my hand under that impact that gives it just a little bit of shock absorbing and eats that impact up a little bit more. So you're probably going to see that happen where I don't hit the blade directly right angle into the other weapon. But I'm going to do a couple of hits from a couple of different angles, and we'll see what happens. Alright, I feel like that was a little less wimpy than my earlier attempt, so y'all ready for the live damage report? Because I'm not. Alright, let's start with the Hatamoto. Again, nothing too extreme, but, well, reasonably energetic and a representative sample of types of blade-to-blade contact. Yeah, that edge is pretty ragged. There are a couple of nicks in that edge that I would say about maybe 0.5 millimeter. Let's do the sound check. This is a triangular kind of cutting file that I use to tone up my edges compared to what it sounded like in the pre-video. Yeah, there's a couple of good snags there. Ooh. I'll tell you what, I'll do a little resharpening and then we'll revisit it again. Not a lot beyond some minor scratching on the side planes. Not too much to speak of on the spine. Let's take a look at some of those other ones. You got to see me use the Christus Imperit 1055. Actually, this is a should be a 1065. Mono-tempered. It's got a lot more spring and a lot more meat and a blunt fort, but I use both edges. Okay, one or two really small nicks. One of the things I noticed after I was done is it took steel off the target sword. So some of what I initially thought was burring was just stuff that flaked right off from the other blade. So considering I went a little bit harder with this, it's in pretty good shape. Minimal damage. All right. We've got our Kingston Arms A-Trim Type 14. It's got a pretty good cutting edge, but it's kind of meaty. I wouldn't try this with some of my really keen-edged European swords that are great cutters because it'd be the same issue with a Japanese-style sword, but this one's got more of an apple seed to it. Mono-tempered spring steel. It's a little tiny bit. This is another one that took steel off the other sword, so it took some of its target with it. Yeah, pretty good. What else we got? We got our Cold Steel Basket Hilt. This is a monster. Oh, what? It's not visible at all. Oh, maybe some very tiny micro rolling. Very tiny. Barely noticeable. Again, it took some steel off the target blade. And finally, the windlass 1860 Cavalry Saber. Has a nice apple seed on it. And here, just again, a little bit. I see, well, barely a little visible nicking there. We're talking significantly less than 1/4 millimeter. Just barely a couple of hairs, if anything. Yeah, so tempering edge geometry. It also has a lot to do with the weight balance and flexibility of the weapon. Now, let me know in the comments, is this a useful, informative test? I'm trying to find, well, unique tests I can do for blades, you know, things that everybody else isn't doing. Would some kind of steel on steel semi-pressure test be something you'd be interested in seeing more of? Are there any swords I've already reviewed that I might go back to? We can run the same tests. I'm probably not going to do it with a lot of my keen-edge Japanese-style swords or my really keen-edge European swords, but anything I feel like could actually take impact like that, I'm willing to give it a go, so let me know. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching, following, subscribing, and I hope to see you back for, well, something more. But Mike, you sword-mangly monster, don't leave us hanging. Did you manage to repair the edge on the poor Hatamoto? A little. There are a couple I couldn't get out. And yes, I had to use power tools. I went out to my 4x36 sander, 600 grit, and then 1000 grit. And I used the flexible part of the belt, kind of like an oversized work sharp. And then just a little bit of touch up. And yeah, there's still a couple of, well, I would say less than 1/2 millimeter gouges where I hit it the hardest, but it's back to functioning. What about the target blade? I forgot to show you that. Yeah. Looks like a spoon that went down the garbage disposal. Don't think I could fix it. Well, you know, I did fix a couple of things that Matthew Jensen destroyed, so I probably could, but I don't really want to. I don't care about this blade so much, so it will probably continue to be used as a target. So, to be continued.